perpetrated by Protestants. And I wanted to show you a methodological framework, including also the figures of Jews, because it's interesting to compare what happened in this peninsula from the late medieval to the early modern period. Well, over the past few years, we have witnessed a deplorable increase in attacks against images. Some of these actions were the result of a strategy to gain visibility through threat, as in the case of the destruction of Palmyra by ISIS. Others were a case of damnatio memoriae, as when the statues were torn off their pedestals to denounce the historical figure they represent for their perceived tyrannical attitudes or their support of ideologies which are considered inappropriate in present-day society. It is not my intention today to talk about such actions, but to reflect on the fact that many of these attitudes have arisen from time to time throughout history. For this purpose, I will focus on the phenomenon of iconoclasm in the Iberian Peninsula, including the matter of sources and related methodological issues. Cursory look to the literature published up the last few decades of the 20th century tell us that the concept of iconoclasm in the Iberian Peninsula was regularly associated and especially associated with Protestants, mainly those of foreign origin, who imported this activity from Northern Europe. Any reference to Muslims or Moriscos was limited to pointing out the resistance to conversion at the Aleka idolatry. In the case of Jewish people, scholars pay attention in the supposed ritual crimes against children at the knife attacks on the consecrated host. This is a very interesting topic that was studied by scholars such as Rodríguez Barral, Joan Molina, François Soyer, and also in a recent chapter in the book I credited Jonathan Glaser-Eitan, in which they discuss how to study these images, comparing them with the inquisitorial trials and other legends. In the past few decades, the range of case studies has significantly widened thanks to the work of researchers such as Pereda, García Arenal, García Marsilla, Hamann, and the aforementioned Glaser-Eitan, Sawyer, Molina, among others. This has enabled the use of comparative methods to explore how and why images were destroyed from the Middle Ages to the early modern period. The main sources for this purpose are the archives of the Inquisition, together with general and local historical chronicles, diatribes against heretics, and miraculous conversions legends. All of these sources are obviously biased, or as Bernard Vincent and Carlo Gisburg describe them, poisoned or toxic, on account of the possible falsehood or half-truth they contain. These texts were the root of certain cliches that were applied indiscriminately to a 15th century Jew and to a 16th century Morisco, and even to a 17th century Jew. A close look at these cliches reveals how they created another who had little to do with any actual people, because it belonged in the sphere of collective imagination rather than real life. Needless to say, this makes it very difficult to discover which cases actually involve violence against images and which were merely an invention. The key is to read the sources comparatively. In this way, we can extract that the Inquisitor were trying to follow a pre-established scheme that was recorded systematically in historian period, or maybe this could be a real case. In this sense, Martín García Arenal, in an article, explained that the best way is to compare each tribunal, each inquisitor in a diachronical way, in order to see in which processes we have, in what trials we have different structure, and maybe this could be a real case and not only an invention by the Inquisition in order to create this otherness. With regard to Jews, the iconoclastic practices attributed to this collective were described in King Alfonso X's literary and legal texts, such as the Cantiga Santa Maria and Siete Partidas, where the desecration of images as an assault on Christian faith invariably ends in the perpetrator's constriction and conversion. The destruction of images in these accounts had, therefore, a catechetical role. You can see here 2 pages of the Cantigas in which a Jew tried to destroy a holy image of Mary or a cross but at the end, after intervention of this Virgin or other priest, at the end, this Jew was converted into Christianity and never destroyed the image. It is obvious that the accusation of iconoclasm was not an Iberian invention. Legends describing Jewish rejection of or hostility to the host reached back to the early Middle Ages and spread widely across Europe, especially since the late 13th century. In this period, they acquire a more specific anti-Jewish meaning. We can find these attitudes in the Bible Moralisée and stained glass church windows. Within the Iberian Peninsula, other examples may be found in apologetic works by authors such as Alonso de la Espina, the well-known Alonso de la Espina, Fortalitium Fidei, a book written around 1459, and particularly chapter 2, entitled Obstinacy and Impunity of Jews Who Do Not Accept the Christian Faith Despite Several Miracles. These legends reached a climax in the Iberian Peninsula with the story of the Beirut Christ and also the story of the Christ of Burgos, who had a very similar legend behind them. And a proliferation of literature it gave rise to. As the story goes, this sculpted image of Jesus Christ, having suffered martyrdom at the hands of Jews, crossed the waters of the Mediterranean and landed near the parish church of El Salvador in Valencia, just in the city center of Valencia, where it has performed miracles and conversion among the faithful ever since. It is a suffering Christ who writhes in pain from the ordeals it has been subjected to. And this story is also linked to the story of the Passio Imaginis, which was used to write Jewish opposition to icons. This story of Passio Imaginis was studied by Pereda, Arciniega, or García Marcilla, and they proved that this story was used in parallel to that of Cristo El Salvador in order to prove how Jews were destroying images in Valencia, and was also used in the 17th century as a propaganda of why the expulsion of Jews was necessary for keeping safe the Catholic faith. We don't have this Passio Imaginis altarpiece now with lost, but we have some engravings in which we can see these Jews destroying crosses in the same way that the Christ of El Salvador suffered before coming to Valencia, or the Christ of Burgos suffered too. These texts were based on anti-Semitic cliches about things Jews were expected to do to images and the basis of what they has done to Christ's body, as, for example, Michael Merbach pointed out. They are the outcome of the specifically xenophobic content of anti-Hebrew literature, that other who must play a particular role in society is revealed in works such as Meditationes Vitae Christi by Caelibus, Some Explico Animae, and also the Perseus Milagros de Nuestra Señora, some of them studied by Blázquez or Kessler. A similar state of affairs can be observed in the records of the inquisitorial trials, where only a very few Jewish defendants recanted the words and kissed the cross as a last resort to avoid punishment. Once again, we find the images are presented in parallel to conversion. As Bodian revealed, those who resisted Christian threats were considered martyrs in their communities. It's interesting to note that the trials focus mainly on the destruction of crosses, such as Alpers or García Marcilla show. Surprisingly, the large corpus of inquisitorial documentation threw up far fewer cases of iconoclasm linked to the images of the Virgin Mary. We should remember that, for example, in the text by Alfonso X, some of these conversion and destruction of images were related to the image of the Virgin. But in Inquisition, we find especially crosses in order to link that they crucified Christ, and now they are crucifying this holy figure. This is significant also because other collectives, such as the Protestants, targeted images regardless of their iconographical content. So they destroy all kinds of images and Jews, especially crosses. This image of the Jews destroying images disappeared or were hid in 16th century Iberia, where we cannot find many description of these acts. Maybe because after the expulsion in 1492, Inquisition and apologetic literature was centered in Moriscos, these Muslims forced to become Christian, these Muslims who had to be assimilated and indoctrinated. So in Inquisition, we find several cases of Jews, but less than in the past because they were expulsed, but some of them remain as conversos. But it's curious how in the 17th century, after the expulsion of Muslims of the Moriscos, when Philip IV was the king of Spain, there was this attitude against Jews was rising and was really important, as, for example, François Soyer studied, and also Claudio Cabero. And this happened also in Italy, as Simona Fecci studied, or also in Portugal, and James Nelson Novoa published in his book about the conversos in that territory. In that period, for example, was published this book in 1634, in which is still recovered this iconography of a Jew destroying images of the Holy Cross, and it's also expressed and used these prints of the Santo Niño de la Guardia, this child who was martyrized by Jews, a late medieval legend, but was used in 17th century in order to justify the expulsion of Jews, in order to condemn the return of some of them to the Iberian Peninsula. The legend of the Santo Niño de la Guardia is very similar to another European legend linked to children, such as St. Hugh of Lincoln. So they were creating cliches in order to condemn this minority. Moving on the aforementioned Moriscos, data came from similar sources, namely accounts of miracles written by authors who have been loudly calling for the expulsion of converts from Islam since the mid-16th century. These stories, they must survive the attack and brought about the aggressor's conversion. By the same token, it put a spotlight on the Moriscos' reluctance to become good new Christians. So at the end, the structure of the legends and the structure of the inquisitorial trials is very similar to the Jews. Other sources are battle chronicles, such a report of the War of Alpujarras and inquisitorial trials record that I will talk about later. The majority of these texts refer to the destruction of crosses that stood on the edges of towns, a good location for a quick getaway. And this is interesting because some apologists of the expulsion, such as Guadalajara y Javier, or such Jaime Bleda, who wrote explaining how this expulsion was good for the Spanish monarchy, explained how these crosses who were in these edges of towns, in the limits of the towns, were built when the Moriscos were destroying them by iron or stone in order to avoid these attitudes. So they explain this typological change of cross related to the Morisco iconoclasm. And this is also an invention because we have these stone crosses from the Middle Ages, but this again use the iconoclasm to create in this otherness. Other texts, although far fewer than this, explain that Moriscos laid the crosses mentioned earlier on the floors of their homes to be trampled on and humiliated. And that sometimes, and this is maybe more interesting, I found two cases of this kind of attitude. They went so far as to wrap them in menstrual rags to desecrate them. And women were so happy to make fun of the cross with these menstrual rags. And I found two cases in different tribunals in different periods, so maybe this could be not a common, but more or less common attitude. However, I must point out that behavior varies depending on the iconography involved, and they carefully avoid Marian figures. A good example can be found in a chronicle of a Morisco rising in the town of Navarrés in the Valencian area, in the wake of the 1609 decree of expulsion. After this decree was published by Philip III, was an important uprising, an important battle, mainly in the area of Granada and Valencia, because they didn't want to accept this decision, and they started to destroy some churches, to destroy some artworks. But it's curious how in this place the Christian who was describing the acts, wrote, "In a painting of Our Lady's Assumption, the faces of the apostles had been stabbed and cut with knives, but the Blessed Virgin remained whole and unmarked." Because, as you know, Mary was also a model of virtue in Islamic theology. So it's curious how he's describing the attitudes against apostles and also Christ, and explain how the virgins were not destroyed in these battles. Many historical trials describe attacks on crosses or images of saints, often following a set pattern, which suggests, as I said at the beginning of this talk, that either the reports were false or there was a standard code for this type of account. At any rate, I agree with Pereda that in the case of Moriscos, both attitudes, profanation and destruction, had a single aim. They were token of resistance to the occupation of the urban space. In other words, the issue behind the disgust some converts felt for those sacred images was not simply a matter of compliance with the law or even of intellectual rejection, metaphysical error, impossibility of representing the unrepresentable, but an issue of social or territorial coexistence in the city. So, with these actions, the Morisco gave visibility to their insubordination to an imposed cult, and the local authorities turned in the argument against them by extending this attitude to other contexts where it did not always apply. It was a sort of propaganda strategy used by the system that oppressed the Moriscos and tried to erase their identity signs. So it's important to know that we find in the inquisitorial trials more cases of destruction of images in moments in which there were more tension between Christian and Muslim and Morisco communities. Maybe in 2 or 3 years we don't find any case of iconoclasts, but in the moments in which there were a negotiation or there were published some edict against Moriscos, these processes grew up. So maybe it's a strategy of making the resistance of this imposed cult visible. It was an act of rebellion that is mirrored today in many acts of image destruction perpetrated by various social collectives. Nevertheless, very few visual representations of this attitude have survived, and they must be treated with caution. A case in point are Francisco Ceylan's engravings above the wall of the Alpujarras, based on drawings by Girolamo Lucenti, for the book Historia Ecclesiastica de Granada, Ecclesiastical History of Granada. They were part of a series representing the fight between Moriscos, Turks, and pirates on one hand, and Christian troops on the other, under the command of Don John of Austria, just before he traveled to Lepanto. This was one of the bloodiest battles in 16th century Iberia, and it ended with the defeat of the Muslim rebels. The insurrection was triggered by the Monfic collective, the most belligerent Morisco group, in response to Philip II's ban on distinctive Morisco features, such as dress and language. We should remember that Charles V led Moriscos to dress as Moriscos, and Philip II tried to erase this identity sign. The engravings that illustrated this Historia Ecclesiastica show the destruction of churches and works of art, together with a sense of children being murdered based on biblical massacre of the innocents. It would be a mistake to interpret these images as a visual chronicle of reality of these iconoclasts for several reasons. First, the artist only had second-hand knowledge of what happened in the war. So Lucenti, North Italian painter of Ceylan from the Low Countries, arrived to Spain after this Alpujarras uprising, and they only have several sources, such as Ginés Pérez de Ita or Diego Hurtado Mendoza chronicles, and some scholars prove that these chronicles are more or less invented. So they are not describing the war, but a particular subjective view of the war. Because in the case of Pérez de Ita, he was orientalizing and making with a Maurophilic way the attitude of Moriscos as heroes, and Hurtado Mendoza was criticizing the attitude of Philip II because he was against him. So at the end, the Moriscos had no written source in which it could inspire the production. Second, there was no visual model for this artist to follow in the creation of this type of scene, because no visual representation of iconoclastic or rebellious action by Moriscos had ever been in Spain. These artists, therefore, resorted to import models from Central Europe. In the case of iconoclasts, the model is very easy to see in this slide, was Franz Hohenberg's well-known iconoclastic fury, 1566. That we have several prints based in this artwork, one of them preserved in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where people are shown climbing ladders to reach the top of a church in order to plunder its treasures, while broken sculpture and painting lie scattered on the ground as a result of Protestant actions. Print of this kind spread quickly across Europe to denounce the heretical attitudes of schismatics and were the obvious source used for their nada engravings. These representations serve a double purpose as formal and conceptual models. From the early days in Iberia, in the days of the Reformation, in Iberia, Protestants were perceived as the great image breakers, and, as I mentioned earlier, the Inquisition extended this role to the Moriscos. An equivalence was therefore established between the two collectives as enemies of the faith who struck against the emblems of the Catholic religion. I find the way these figures are portrayed also surprising. None of them, none of the characters were typical Morisco clothes. You can compare how Baiditz, a German travel, depict these Moriscos and how Helena Lucenti depict in a very different way. They all look North African, and in other prints, they look Turkish, from the Ottoman army. We have no evidence that the new Christians who live in the mountains of Granada had garments of that kind in their homes, since they do not appear in extant inventories. We have studied these inventories and we did not find these Turkish garments or North African garments. So they were also inviting a way in which they were represented. This led me to infer that the artist took the liberty to misrepresent, or shall I say, to cross-dress the Moriscos, driven by collective ill-feeling towards a group that was seen, the Moriscos was seen, an ally of the Turks, particularly in the late 16th and the early 17th centuries. We don't know how many Ottomans or pirates supported the Morisco side, but in these pictures, everybody is dressed in like them rather than like new Christians. They are being identified with the enemy, first by the Turkish guard, and second by the composition of the scene, which follow closely the pattern seen in European images. The meaning of these words is crystal clear. Whoever attacks a representation of divinity deserves punishment, and these images can be used as evidence of the will. So my point of view is that we should take into account that they were two foreigner artists who imported the models they studied in their own countries. For example, in the Low Countries, he knew, in case of Lucenti, the engravings by Dürer about the Turks, and also in North Italy, Lucenti knew the representation of Turks, mainly in the area of Venice, because in which there were a lot of representation of Turkish, and they also used several schemes, such as the Massacre of the Innocents. We can see it is very similar to other artworks in which is represented this massacre, because at the end, the Justino Antolínez, who wrote this text, is trying to prove that Christians who died in this war should be considered martyrs. So they are comparing the martyrdom of the innocents and the martyrdom of the Christian who died in that war. And also they were using other very well-known compositions, such as Serlio image of how a stage of a tragedy should be represented, how in the theater tragedy should be represented. So the architecture of these engravings is very similar. So at the end, I think this is not a chronicle of the war. This is not a visual chronicle of the war, neither a chronicle of the Morisca iconoclast, but at the end, it's also an invention made by the painters in order to create this otherness, in order to justify the martyrdom as the Archbishop of Granada wanted at that time. Now we are moving to Protestant in this very quick trip around these minorities in Iberia. They were also the group that less discriminated among iconographical targets in the Iberian Peninsula. Any icon was liable to destruction, be it a saint, a virgin, or a cross. And it's interesting to note that most of these offenders were from Bern region in France, England, the Netherlands, and to a lesser extent, Portugal. And we should remember that Portugal was part of the Spanish crown during the Iberian Union with Philip II and Philip III, a little time with Philip IV. So they were not considered a foreigner, such as French, England, and Netherlands travelers. These foreigners justified their actions by linking them to Calvin or even to Ciprianos de Valera, who, as is well known, translating Calvin's work into Spanish and wrote the foreword where he explains how Catholics use images in a bad way to convert minorities and why Protestants had a more intellectual theology of images. In fact, a large number of inquisitorial trials against Protestants include theological reflections by the accused in their reports, side by side with simple statements like, I do what I saw done in my country, or I destroyed this cross because it's only a piece of wood. We find these digressions of a theological and doctrinal nature, discussing the value of images with references to biblical texts and to the writings of medieval and early modern theologians. These attitudes resemble those studied by Friedberg and Christine, among others, in Central Europe. And we don't find this kind of explanation in Morisco's Jews and all Christian trials captured by the Inquisition. They appear especially in the Lutheran convicts. And not only over two processes, I found around 20-25 processes in which this foreigner explained with a very high-level theological words why he destroyed the images, even given some references that we know that maybe the Inquisitors never known. On the other hand, it should be noted that the number of attacks of images by Spaniards, is very small. These incidents tended to take place in marketplaces where foreigners displayed the kind of attitudes they had witnessed in their place of origin. This agrees with the fact that there were very few kernels of Lutheran activity in Hispanic territories, such as Michel Boglan, Miguel Fernández Terricabras have proved. No? So we find especially cases of iconoclasts in commercial cities such as Barcelona, Valencia, Seville, sometimes in Valladolid because there were a small group of Protestants there, but especially were developed in these areas. And this is important because, according to the records, people from the geographical areas I mentioned earlier were less likely to be presumed innocent. I found several cases of destruction of images by a Spaniard who supposed to be Protestant, but at the end he was not killed by Inquisition, but in the case of foreigners, usually found with a bad end. In fact, several trials resulted in certain prints being banned without prior detailed examination of the images on the ground that they originated in France or the Low Countries. The iconographies displayed on these prints were not heretical, but the presence of words in German was considered a sign of potential heretical content. I found a very interesting process in Valencia, Madrid, and also in Mexico, the same, because they sent letters between all the tribunals in which a very typical Low Country iconography, Catholic iconography, as it was not well known by the Inquisition, and it had several words in French, this was prohibited, and this prohibition arrived also to America. It's interesting to see how the procedence of the prince or the procedence of the people has an effect in the result of the judgment. Some clergymen in charge of Morisco's conversion, such as Ignacio de las Casas, Jaime Bleda, or the Bishop of Valencia, Patriarca Rivera, also Patriarch of Antioch, studied these Protestant attitudes linking to the Moriscos one. For instance, in chapter 34 of Bleda's on the Miracle of the Cross, entitled Of the Connivance Between the Sects of Muhammad and Luther, Calvin and other heretics of our time, and the close friendship that unites them, Bleda compares the modus operandi of both heretical groups, expressed the fallacy that Lutheran doctrine denies the cult of images, and this is not true because we know that Luther was agreed with the catechetical goal of images, and this was linked to the attitudes by Muslims. And Bleda asked God's help to overcome the serious religious crisis provoked by the coexistence in the peninsula of these two anti-Catholic sects, as well as the threat they pose to the Catholic visual heritage. In this book, explain these changes in the typology of process that I said before. These comparisons are also present in inquisitorial records. Joan Pallés, so a local individual, tried in 1582, was accused of saying that a crucifix was a piece of wood. And this was considered an offense against God, our Lord, because saying these words about Christianity foremost icon mean that he was accused as Moorish or Lutheran. So the Inquisition was not defining his Moorish or Lutheran, maybe because he's from a Spanish origin. He's from Catalonia, he's a Catalan, he's not a foreigner, so he could be Moorish or Lutheran for having this bad attitude against an image. This shows a certain degree of confusion among inquisitors as to the nature of non-Catholic doctrine, as evidenced in other trial records in which Moors, Moriscos, and Protestants were lumped together to such an extent that sometimes the word Erasmist is used to define foreign iconoclast, when, as we know, the man of Rotterdam was not remotely in favor of this type of action. So it's curious when the individual is from Spain, they have doubts if it could be a Morisco or a Protestant. And finally, as for all Christians, few cases of destruction of images by members of this group are present in their records, and even less in legends and chronicles. The majority focus on failure to show due reverence to icons or harboring doctrinal doubts. The defenders do not know the difference between worshipping God and worshipping saints and angels, and the court tries to set them right by instructing them on proper behavior towards images. It's interesting, I found around 7 processes in which, trials in which all Christians went to the Inquisition to ask what to do with images, as summon them after destroying one of these crosses. And we also find a handful cases of ritual practices linked to sorcery, which occasionally involve burning images for esoteric purposes. By their number, it is significant if we compare with Muslims and Protestant cases. This will support my initial claim that both the Inquisition and the apologists and the chroniclers, who were on the whole anti-Jewish, anti-Muslim, needed to create a visible other who was diametrically opposed to all Christian and Catholics, and who could be denigrated and used as a means to demand the conversion or expulsion of Jews and Muslims. Clear examples are literary works that use the destruction of images as an excuse to show the others' intransigence and to proclaim the power of God, who makes such people reflect on their bad faith and convert. Together with the inquisitional trials, these types of texts make use of images for the purpose of creating others and building identities. I would like to end by presenting a very unusual case involving an old Christian, a Catholic, a local one, which was the subject of an article written jointly by Byron Hammond and myself. One of the reasons why this case was exceptional is that one of the partially destroyed prints was attached to the inquisitorial records, and this is not really usual. This made it variable because it made it possible to visually ascertain the damage suffered by the image. It's a proof, it's an evidence. It has also been very useful for us, as there are hardly any extant prints for that period in the Aragon crown due to the perishable nature of the material. So we don't have, as happened, for example, in the Low Countries, many prints of that period. And it's curious how this process in the Inquisition led us to know a little bit more about how these prints were in Valencia and in the crown of Aragon. So had a double, very important for these two reasons. The Inquisition accounts of this story begins on 26th of October of 1556, when Diego de Sevilla, Diego of Seville, appeared before the Sacred Court of the Inquisition in Valencia. And he was asked if he knew or suspected the reason for his summons, which he initially denied. But soon he admitted that he had made wiseless or fireworks out of some prints of the Passion that he had purchased as part of a job lot from the bookseller Cosme Damian. Maybe he admitted that he knew why he was there because he seen in the room several people who participated in this public spectacle. The interrogation continued when the Inquisitor asked if he knows that these were papers of the Passion and why did he make wiseless or fireworks with them. He replied that he knew it was the Passion of Jesus Christ represented, but thinking it was good paper, he made them, not in bad faith or with bad intention. So he was choosing carefully the words in order to avoid the punishment. So, he said that he a Christian because he know what is represented there, but he also said that he only did this because it's a good paper to create a very good sound of the fireworks, and but he had no bad intentions. At the end of his deposition, Diego was imprisoned by the Holy Office. 10 days later, the bookseller, Cosme Damian, testified in front of the Inquisition. He admitted the sale, but denied knowing the paper would be used to make fireworks, and even added that the material was not suitable for that purpose. So it's opposite, it's not the same that the Diego Sevilla said before. Cosme Damian added that if they would think that the aforesaid Diego Seville intended to make fireworks out of those papers, he would not have sold them to him. He's always saying that he has nothing to do. He's a friend and he did not know the purpose of these prints. 3 weeks later, Diego Sevilla was sentenced to remain inside the city of Valencia and to pay costs to the sum of 100 ducats. And this is the last we hear from the Valencian firework maker and his excuse. It is a particular case because it's proof how all Christians also attack images and how local has a different treatment that foreigners again in front of the Inquisition when they testify, only saying that he did not in a bad faith or bad intention. He had a better treatment than others who only only catch it because they were supposed Protestants. So the goal of this process was not to build an image of the heretic or the infidel, but it helped us to show how many Catholics have problems with the usage of images. As I said, I found a lot of processes in which they explain they don't know what to do with images. By the way, none of them destroy images as Diego Sevilla did. This trial helped us to understand the story of iconoclasts in the Iberian Peninsula, not always as a tale of confrontation between heretics and Christians, or as a tool to give visibility to non-conformity to a cult that was imposed from above. And this also proved that these Catholic cases were hid in order to make stronger the opposition between Christian and Catholic and Muslim Jews and Protestants. Although this was the most common situation in the case of Jewish Morisco Protestant iconoclasts, the phenomenon itself was far more complex and had many variants, including such curious cases as the story of Diego de Sevilla and his firewalls, among others, that I have no time to show you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franco, for this fascinating. I can hear an echo when I talk. Fascinating paper. Okay, now we're going to open to the floor for questions. Luciana and I are collecting these the questions, but I do have other. I have lots of questions actually, but let's listen to the people first. Luciana? Luciana is mute. But anyway, while I'm waiting for Luciana, since I found it fascinating about these images that you are showing to us, and the role of the role of the Catholics in destroying the images for other internal problems. And I also came to mind the persecution of Protestants who are artists. I suppose you know the case of Esteban Jamete, do you? Yes, that is, you are mute, Esteban Jamete and things like that are absolutely fascinating. But it's so concentrated what you have told us that it's difficult to start with. But could you say a little bit more about Vaidits, the representation of the Moriscos in Vaidits and the other images that you've shown us?
Yes, thanks for your talk, for your question. Well, in the case of Vaidits, it's a typical image we use to show how the Morisco is supposed to be. Despite we know that at the end, if we compare the documents we found in the archives, they are not, Moriscos really did not dress like Vaidits represent. Vaidits was traveling to the Iberian Peninsula with a purpose that is to find this Oriental Spain, this exotic nation that, for example, Barbara Fuchs wrote in his book. But if we compare the description of Morisco that we have by locals, or, for example, the paintings by Bigarni in the Royal Chapel, or also others, we find that Vaidits is not really portraying Moriscos, but creating the Moriscos he had in mind or he thought to find in Spain. Because it's curious how he usually represents only from Moriscos from Granada and women from Granada, such in Valencia, Barcelona, Toledo. There were no Moriscos. So he was looking for a Morisco, a Orientalist Morisco. By the way, I use this print, this painting, because it's interesting, because the images of two foreigners are different in different moments. So at the beginning, when they were looking for this Oriental Morisco, they pick like this, but when they trying to link Moriscos with Turks, or link with the previous ideas they have in their own territories about the otherness, about the enemy, they use other models more close to Dürer or to Bellini or other Italian painters. So at the end, the Ima de Morisco is a construction. It's a visual construction to prove their otherness, to prove how they were different to Spaniards. Well, if we follow the records of other chronicles, they were not as different as as these sources prove. In fact, some of these texts explain how it was different to distinguish a Morisco and an old Christian because they say the same face, or some of them wear the same clothes. So I think these prints are really fascinating, and it's a tool to show otherness as the Inquisition did with these iconoclast acts.
Yes, I do agree with you, because I think he has a hegemonic view of what the Moriscos are the other people. I totally agree. I completely that. But on the other hand, in my study of the African presence in Spain in that moment, I took the representation by Vides not as a proof of what they were, etc., but at least it was indirectly, even if they were colluding with hegemonic ideas. Nevertheless, we could take those drawings, those ink and drawings as a evidence of their presence. This is what I thought in my studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so just to pick up some aspect of that, which is beyond perhaps his intentions, obviously. It was hegemonic, but nevertheless, they were visual documents of their presence, even if there is misconceived, etc.
Yes, these drawings led us to compare the local construction of the otherness, the foreign construction,
Exactly.
and also approve a source to see how there were many images of Moriscos. And this was also a mutable image, that it was not only a portrait. I mean, you know, the same a Morisco depicted by a foreigner in the early 20s than a Morisco depicted after the expulsion. And I'm agree with you. It's a proof. It's an important source to study this, but taking into account that he was seduced by this Oriental vision of Granada, and this is important to have in mind. And Granada was not an exotic place for Spaniards; was an exotic place for travelers, for foreigners. So I not agree with the idea of exotic nation. It was exotic for foreigners, but for locals, La Alhambra, the mosque of Cordoba, was integrated in the life of this Christian Muslim society.
Exactly. Okay, Lucia, I can carry on, but Luciana, are there any questions?
Yeah. We have Mike. Do you want to say something, Mike Pope?
I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me. Hi.
Who is speaking? Is it
Anna? I asked a question on the chat.
Though she's asking to Mike Pope, don't you?
I think Mike Pope.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, Mike Pope.
Mike.
Hi, no, I'm still thinking about my question. So
okay, Anna then.
Yeah. No
okay,
rush.
so Anna, sorry, it's your turn now.
Anna.
Sorry, up again. Yes. So thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering if you had any insights on the impact of these attempted acts on destructions on the images themselves. Like, did they change the meaning they had for people, or the spaces in which they were stored? Did they acquire any properties after this attempted act of destruction? Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Yes, in fact, many images who were destroyed or partially destroyed at that period by Protestant or Moriscos or Jews, and I explained the case of Christ of El Salvador or Christ of Burgos, created some legends who were used to explain the uses of images and the power of the images using the workshop by Birkbeck. It's curious, for example, how Bleda in this book, 400 Miracles of the Cross, is using these destroyed or partially destroyed images to create a theory about images and about how to pray them. But mainly these accounts, these books are related to people who are agree with the expulsion of these minorities. So it's also a bias discourse who was created. The same happened, for example, with Jews in 17th century. This maybe François Soyer could add something, but these images create a debate about the use of images, but also were legends created by people who usually is against this minority, so are biased. This helped us to compare the official story and the others, but yes and no. They created a new way to understand the images, but a biased way to do it.
Thank you.
Akemi, do you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that incredible presentation, Borja. It was really revealing. I work more on the Jewish trials and cases in the Americas, and especially because I looked at the tribes of Israel and Zurbarán's paintings of the tribes of Israel. And I had two questions. One of them was if in any of those Inquisition trials you've been looking at, there was evidence that some Jews had images, Old Testament images, and whether they had a special veneration for them. I think I found Marcela Poiré, who's a professor in Mexico, actually found some trial in Lima where there were some Jews that were trialed for venerating images of Old Testament queens, which was quite interesting. And then another question is, well, I find quite interesting the fact of showing the specific images of Jews attacking crucifixions more than any other image. And there's this incredible painting in Cuzco, Peru, dating to the 18th century in the Museo Regional by an anonymous artist of Jews stepping over a crucifixion and mocking it. And it is very interesting that this was painted in the 18th century, because in Peru, especially, most Inquisition trials took place in the first half of the 17th century. So in this case, it does not correspond, curiously, to the rise in the presence of these uprisals by Jews and Muslims as it is in Spain, no? So I was wondering if you have more information about these two things.
Thanks for your questions. The first one, I think, is interesting. I found several in several trials that on several documents that they have a special veneration to some sense of the Old Testament. In fact, there is a good article by Fernando Marias about conversos artists. It's in Spanish, English. It's more or less the same article, in which he explains how Spanish conversos artists usually depict more a sense of the Old Testament, and in the trial we have the same. They have more devotion to these images, and it's the same happened with Moriscos. We compare documents related to the material culture of this minority. We find usually Oriental devotions or saints who have any link to Turkey or to North African territories. So they are a Christian saints, but related to these topics. And in areas such as Castile, in which they were more Christianized than others, as Granada or Valencia, in which they remain to being crypto-Muslim. So yes, I found in some trials some evidences of this link of Jews with a sense of the Old Testament. We also find this in some painters, converso painters, such as Fernando Marias has studied. By the way, Jonathan Eiser-Gleitan has presented his dissertation, I think 2 months ago, in the Hopkins University, in which he compares some images with the trials of the Inquisition of Cuenca, and he found also a lot of these ideas. So maybe it's good for you to talk with Jonathan. I can give you the email if you want, if you don't have it, and to talk about this dissertation, because it's still unpublished, and this could help you to find more sources to justify this. And the second question, I don't really have a clear answer, but you explain how in the 18th century still some of these legends remains in some territories such as Peru, but the same happened with Muslims. Yesterday I was talking with Maria Feliciano, who worked in images of Muslims in New Spain, in Mexico, and we found several crosses or several images linked to the Muslims and linked also to attitudes between admiration and awe. Sometimes images who are described wearing al-malafas, a typical Islamic dress, and others who have linked to the iconoclast of Muslims. So I think some of these legends came time to time to in these territories, and this happened with Jews and with Muslims. I can give you more information, I'm sorry, but I think it happened also with other minorities.
Thanks, Borja. We have a question from Marshall. Marshall, Martin, are you there?
Hello, yes, it's Marshall Mateer from Yorkshire in England. Hello, I was thinking that today we have instant communication, and if somebody doesn't like what you do or say, they have it tweeted out to the whole world in about 30 seconds. Looking at and thinking of the engravings in particular that were shown, is there any notion of how long things took between events and images, and how were the images distributed? How long did that take? What were the means by which they were distributed? And I suppose that asks the question, who saw them? Who was the reading audience? I'm thinking most of all about the, I think you said images that were made in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. But in general, does that make sense?
Yes, thanks for your question. I think that prints travel faster than we really think at the beginning. For example, I have studied the presence of some artists in Italy or the Low Countries, and how when they come back to Spain, they brought all the prints or all the drawings he did or he copied in those territories. And we know how some important archbishops, as Patriarca Rivera in Valencia, also in Granada and Seville, imported several prints, and just after it was printed in the origin. For example, in fact, in Valencia and in Madrid, we have several copies of Caravaggio's artworks made only 1 year later that Caravaggio put this picture, this painting in the chart. So things travel very fast, and the prints I have shown about Protestant iconoclasm is at the end of 16th century, and these prints made by Ceylan was at the beginning of 17th century. So they have like 20 years to arrive to Spain, and this a lot when we have several studies that prove that they arrive quickly, like maybe 2 or 3 months. And another proof will be this inquisitorial trial, in which I found a letter recommending to avoid the distribution of these prints. And the difference between the letter sent from Madrid to Valencia with these prints and Madrid to Mexico with the same prints, the difference are 1 month. 1 or 2 months. So prints travel very fast, and even faster than we think.
Thank you.
Carmen, would you like to ask something?
Yes, I have more questions for you. I have another question before, because this follows the one that you reply now. I'm interested if you could send me something about the thing that you discovered about Caravaggio, the prohibition of circulating this is very important for me vis-a-vis.
Well, I'm not saying that Caravaggio was prohibited. I was saying that I have a process in clinical trial in which one print is prohibited.
Well, I'm interested in that one.
Okay.
Anyway, yes, that would be fantastic. And my question was, because sorry about my ignorance about the iconoclastic problem. You said that the most vilified image was the crucifixion, right? And not the Virgin. The Virgin was preserved somehow. But I didn't quite grasp why. What is it that makes, because I just came to mind in the book of Kevin Ingram about this group, the 17th century group about the La Granada, about something about these conversos secret meetings. And I wonder in which the Immaculate Conception was actually the center, and it was completely defended by conversos. So I wonder why is it that the Virgin, I didn't quite understand why the Virgin was spared of this.
Well, Mary was a model of virtue in Islamic theology as a good mother. And in fact, we have several images of Virgin in some North African communities, and also in some inventories of moriscos. This was a typical iconography. In fact, when Hernando Talavera tried to convert moriscos after the conquest of Granada, the iconography he used to negotiate with al-Faqirs, to negotiate with the leaders of these moriscos, were images of Mary. And he gave as a present some sculpture of the Virgin Mary, Mary for the moriscos, obviously, to negotiate. And in fact, when Charles V rethink the area of the Alhambra and build his palace and rebuild some doors, in the main door, in which people suppose that he was going to put to include St. James the Moor Slayer, because it's a very powerful image against Muslims, he preferred to include a Virgin Mary because it's a soft message, a message of negotiation, because he knew that the Moriscos have a special devotion of this. And in fact, I don't remember in which document I read, but I can check it. In some cases, Protestants told to Catholics, Spanish Catholics from Spain, that they supported the Immaculate Conception because they were half Muslims. So it's curious, this accusation. But from the beginning, Mary was a tool for a negotiation between communities, and maybe because of that, they did not destroy, and the chronicles and the trials take care with this iconography, because if the trial need to prove one evidence, if the evidence is destroying image of Mary, is not true, because we know that this never happened. It's connected to the theology of Muslims.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Is any other question, Luciana? Because I have.
Alexandra, would you like to ask?
Good afternoon again. I really enjoy your presentation. I would like to ask, even partially, as I wrote, even partially, an image got destroyed. Can lose the power of the meaning for the relevant group of people in the long term. Can you understand what I mean?
No, in fact, that one image were partially destroyed sometimes increase the meaning of this image, because it's a proof of the attitude of the other against a powerful icon of the religion. So these partially destroyed images were used in several contexts to prove the intransigence of the others, but also to prove the power of the images that finally this survived and sometimes convert. In fact, in the books talking about the Passion Imaginis and the Christ of Burgos and Christ of El Salvador, they explain how these miracle half-destroyed images produce several conversions. So I think never lost, but increase the power.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Are there any other questions? No?
I have another question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I come?
Yeah.
Sorry. Well, don't ask questions. I'm going to monopolize you. I'm also curious about the iconography that they adopt, like because you said they have to create a new iconography because such a thing didn't exist before. So the creation of an iconography is based on, partly is based on the massacre of the innocent, and partly from what I understood from the Northern Europeans' propaganda against the Spanish Empire. No, and you have to tell me again, I know that they fly and circulate the prints, but how were they found? Was there any evidence of production of these prints in Spain?
Well, we about this propaganda, we don't have many evidences. There is a book by Cristina Foncuberta who talk about Cristina Foncuberta. I can write it in the chat.
Yes, I know her. I know her.
So, in which he explained how some prints and some Protestant prints arrived to the Spanish territory. But we don't have any proof that Helena Lucenti have access to these prints. My point is that if they moved to Spain when they were around 20 years old, so they passed the examination of the guild in their own cities, in the education, in the educational process in their own countries, they studied these prints and could transport it to Spain. So I don't have a document to prove that Sergio and Kogenberg were in the houses of these painters, but we know, for example, that Celio arrives to Granada at the late 16th century, and we know that in Italy there is a lot of engravings with this of this treatise of architecture. So, and they were used to education of artists. So it's more make a puzzle of things that could happen, but at the end they were not portraying nothing typical from Spain. So this should be important. This is the key.
Fascinating, fascinating. I got another question, but let's see if there is some question available, Luciana.
No. No.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you. You show an image of a book by Francisco de Rojas Nieto in 1614. Who is this Francisco de Rojas Nieto? No te escucho. No. You are mute, Borja.
You are mute.
You can't hear. Okay.
No, it's not. It was not. It was
you were mute. You were mute.
Well, it was related to the court in Spain. So he's part of this trend to try to create a anti-Jewish iconography. So it's related to the Madrid court and was living around there.
But it's just that it comes to mind a converso with the same name that lives in Rome later, and is becoming in contact with Velázquez. So this is why I wonder if it is from the same family or not.
I don't really know. I don't really know. I'm sorry, but I can try to find more information about this. But it's good.
Yeah.
But it's also curious because in some cases, people who wrote treatises against Jews were conversos in order to justify that they were good Christians. So maybe it's possible. In this case, I don't want to say nothing that is not true. So I can study more this case, but I can add anything.
Right. No, it's curious. It's just the name and everything. It calls my attention about that. Well, I
have a question. Sorry.
Fantastic, Mike.
That's okay.
Yeah.
You come in, Mike.
Forgive me if this doesn't make much sense because I'm still trying to put it all together after listening to the talk. But you mentioned a few minutes ago about Charles V and the image of the Virgin Mary in Alhambra. And also at the start of your talk, you discussed how after the Moriscos were exposed, you see more cases of conversos and Jews coming into the Inquisition. And I was just wondering if you'd ever thought about how the change of the different kings from Carlos V to Philip II and so on changes the response in the conversos and Moriscos and other minority groups in Iberia. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's a difficult question, but I think Charles V has a more positive attitude against Moriscos than Philip II. First of all, because he continued the Pacific approach that Hernán Talavera started after the conquest of Granada, that was interrupted by Cardinal Cisneros. But later, Charles V thought that this was a good option. Why? Because he had a lot of problems in the frontiers with Hungary and in the Mediterranean. So he thought that maybe it was useful to have a negotiation, a Pacific negotiation with these others in order to avoid internal problems in the Iberian Peninsula. In fact, in the altarpiece of the Capilla Real Granada, in which represented the conquest of Granada, appeared the conversion of Moriscos, and in this work, there are two Moriscos dressed as rich people, because it's proving how some old Narrid aristocracy helped Charles V and was a negotiation. And also in the last arc of the entrance of Charles V in Seville for the wedding ball with Isabella of Portugal, in the last arc in which are represented all the countries, all the groups under the power of Charles V were described as German, Italian, Flemish, Indians, and Moriscos, all to the same level. So for them, for him, Moriscos were important in the Spanish as a community. In fact, in 1526, in La Junta Capilla Real, in la Capilla Real, a meeting there in Granada in order to see what to do with Moriscos, because some nobles were having problems with them. He defended Moriscos, and he led Moriscos to dress with their own clothes and to continue with some of these traditions in order to pacify the area. And also curious how in his funerals, I have studied all the catafalques created for his funeral. We don't find any bad image of Moriscos. All are Turks or North Africans. And in the case of Philip II, it's very different. Philip II had many problems with Muslims, mainly with those who live in the Alpujarras, and he started to discover some contacts of Moriscos with North African spies and the French king. There were some letters between Ottoman Empire, Spanish Moriscos, and French people, and the French king. He created a tension between Moriscos and Philip II. And just because of that, he decided to interrupt this Pacific approach and to forbid Moriscos to continue their life, when we know that in territories such as Castilla-La Mancha or Aragon, Zaragoza, they lived as Christians. They were very well integrated in society. So this, at the end, this prohibition created was the beginning of this war of Alpujarras, in which the Moriscos had the help of Ottomans and pirates. And at that moment, the image of Moriscos was also getting worse in visual culture and some text. In fact, in the royal entry of Austria in Madrid, Morisco appeared under the feet of the king, or in the catafalque of Philip II, we find the Morisco represented as black animals who are running away of Granada. So they were animalized. So it was not this positive behavior of Charles V. In fact, the war of Alpujarras was at the same level in the Seville catafalque than the Lepanto battle. So for him, or for the ideologues of this program, this war was as important as Lepanto was. And it was the beginning. Philip III, in which he had several problems. He lost a lot of battles, so he decided to expulse Moriscos for many reasons, but one of them to show how finally with him Spain was free of impure blood in the territory. So the image of Moriscos and the relationship with the kings were changing, but also due to the politics with on the relationship with other crowns and other territories of North Africa and Central Europe.
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Sylvia, would you like to ask your question? Sylvia?
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I just wrote my question in the chat, but yes, basically I was wondering when Borja was explaining how some images being destroyed, they became more powerful. If that like so-called like power at some point become like fetishized as an object, like an example where those images that have been destroyed, they somehow like become like valuable as objects, as assets for their like, I don't know, like value exchange, resale price, something like that. Thank you.
Thanks for.
You're muted, Borja. You can hear you.
Now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thanks for your question. I know that Professor Antonio Urquizar is now finishing a book about this material culture and how at the prices of these objects in an interconfessional society, and he's studying this topic. But as far as I know, this has not more valuable in terms of money, but just in terms of proof of a multicultural society. For example, when they try to defend how Christians who were killed in the war of Alpujarras were martyrs, they used these destroyed images and they used some pieces of church to prove that this was a very important war and how Christians defended their faith. And these objects are still preserved in some churches in the Alpujarras, on the mountains. And I know that now is an anniversary of this war, the 450 years of this war. The Archbishop of Granada is still trying that these Christians who have lost their life in this war were considered martyrs. They started to ask again to the Pope this, and they were using not only some paintings created mainly in 18th century, not contemporary to this war, and also some fragments of artworks to defend their position and to defend why these Christians should be become martyrs. So not in the terms of money, but this in terms of the faith and devotion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Borja. Are there any kind of burning questions that haven't been asked yet? If not, I think we can finish the recording now. And because we don't have drinks, we